Hi, and welcome to class. For those of you watching, we were just discussing maybe getting new theme music, maybe Barry Sadler and Country Joe McDonald. So if you feel strongly about this, call in at. Okay. We're going to continue. We finally finished Kennedy, so there's a real triumph. And we're going to talk today about the period where the American involvement in Vietnam really escalates dramatically. This is the period often referred to as Americanization, which is a term we use basically to imply that the United States takes over the war. So we'll get to that. This is going to be the only web page outline that I'm going to have up today. The Muse of Technology. I think the name is Microsoftia. Once more bit me on the butt, and so my web page is down. So I'm going to go with handwritten outlines the old-fashioned way, but this one from last week I hope still works. And if you recall at the end of last week, any thing like Bullwinkle and Rocky, you know, kind of an announcer doing a voiceover. When we last met our heroes, we talked a little bit about the American response to the Tonkin Gulf affair and how Johnson, for the first time, unleashes air attacks. And this leads, in fact, to the capture of the first American POW, Everett Alvarez. And at the same time, the Americans are starting to, well, they've always understood this, but come to an even graver understanding of the situation in Vietnam. Whereas there was always this sense before that maybe somehow the Vietnamese could do things for themselves and correct things. By 1964, and clearly by 1965, everyone in Washington, everyone in Saigon on the American side understands that the enemy, the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front, the PAVN, Ho Chi Minh, however you want to refer to them, is really on the verge of victory. And unless the United States does a great deal more, essentially takes over the war, then enemy victory is pretty much certain. And there's a real understanding of that. And, you know, there may have been an understanding of that well before this point, because at various stages, the VC were, it seemed, on the verge of victory, and America came in, and either through the introduction of advisors or armor or firepower or money or whatever was able to stave that off. But by 1964, it's becoming far more difficult. And so the United States, after the events in Tonkin, begins flying missions, air attacks, over into northern Vietnam for the first time it crosses the 17th parallel, and essentially begins to take over the war. Now, this is not done smoothly or easily. Nothing will be throughout the period of the Vietnam War. And in fact, one thing you'll find, one dynamic you'll find, which is something I've covered in my book. I had initially planned on basically taking time out and discussing the stuff I did, but I think it's easier if I just integrate aspects of what I found into the basic chronology. I think it flows easier that way. So that's why we're not going to actually discuss it as a separate entity. But one thing that you'll see throughout 64 and 65 is that there's a real difference of opinion there between what a lot of the civilian leaders want to do and what a lot of the military folks think should be done. And one thing that may run counter to many people's stereotypes, certainly ran counter to mine, was that in fact the civilians were far more aggressive than the military was. And I think this goes back to the stuff we talked about during week 1 and 2 about the nature of Cold War liberalism and America's vision for the world. And if you look at it in the bigger context, Vietnam makes sense, and the fact that civilians were aggressive makes sense, because America's mission, especially after 1945, but throughout the whole 20th century, was to kind of bring American values and bring American influence and American economic activity, of course, to the rest of the world. And when a small, fairly insignificant country in the big picture, like Vietnam, and really only half a country north of the 17th parallel in Vietnam, challenges that, and challenges it fairly successfully up to this point, it's not surprising then that administration officials like Lyndon Johnson or Robert McNamara or the Bundy brothers or Walt Rostow would respond aggressively. These men were products of the Cold War. They were the best and the brightest, as David Halberstam dubbed them. And so it's not really surprising that they would not be willing to kind of step back and say, maybe this isn't a good idea. Military folk, on the other hand, are quite often looking at this and saying, this may not be a good idea. And again, that's not necessarily surprising coming from their perspective. the American military has a vast number of commitments by the 1960s. It has commitments in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. It has bilateral mutual defense treaties all over the globe. There are American bases everywhere. And so when the military looks at the world, it can't get involved everywhere. It cannot fight major wars wherever there is a hot spot. And so it has its own priorities, and these would be, you know, obviously the defense of North America, but then in terms of major enemies, it would be, who would America's major enemies be from the military perspective? China and the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China. And in fact, they quite often put together lists of military priorities, and Vietnam is pretty low. I mean, really only Latin America is lower than Vietnam, and in Latin America there's no threat. I mean, Latin America is essentially part of the U.S. for defense purposes. So Vietnam is not terribly important. The military recognizes that, and they're the ones who have to fight as well. And, you know, it's a lot easier to be pro-war when you're not actually going into battle. And in fact, within the military, one thing that you'll also see is that among military leaders, Air Force and naval officials quite often are far more aggressive than Marine and Army officials will be. And again, because the Air Force, you know, offend everybody in the Air Force, but they're not going to fight at the same level the Army is. They're going to fight an air war, and quite often, you know, one thing Army people I've talked to would often say is, yeah, these guys would eat dinner, you know, sit down at home, and not at home, but sit down at the base and eat dinner after a bombing mission, whereas Army and Marines really face a different kind of threat. And so they're actually, within the military context, have a fairly strong aversion to war in Vietnam. And all this is really starting to become even more pronounced in 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin situation. It's ironic because this kind of division within the military is especially strong over the air war. And I think I mentioned this last time. At that time and since then, many people have suggested that the U.S. fought with one hand tied behind its back, which is the constant kind of mantra you hear. And within that, many say LBJ, you know, was too restrained with regard to the air war. And the implication there is that everybody agreed that if the air war had been waged without any restraints whatsoever, that it would have succeeded. But in fact, the biggest critics of air power from 1964, and as we'll see into 1965, were military people themselves, especially Army officials. So the U.S. is taking over, but there's a great deal of doubt with regard to just what might happen. For example, when the air war begins in 1964, many military officials really questioned whether it would work. Earl Wheeler, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, Harold K. Johnson, who was the Army Chief of Staff, Admiral David McDonald, the Chief of Naval Operations, William Westmoreland, the MAC-V commander, and Maxwell Taylor, General Maxwell Taylor, who was the ambassador, all feared that the introduction of American air power might overstrain the RVN. These people, far more, I think, than the civilians did, understood that the key to success in Vietnam would be having a legitimate government below the 17th parallel. To fight against the enemy would prove nothing or would gain nothing unless there was actually an indigenous government there that could, at some point, lead the Vietnamese people below the 17th parallel. And their fear is that American involvement is going to overstrain the RVN. Remember, from the Diem coup in '63 up to February of '65, in that, 16-month period, there are over a dozen different governments. So there's real chaos there. And the introduction of American air power could make things even worse. One thing also to keep in mind, and this is something that often gets lost in the shuffle, is that the Vietnamese in the South, Diem, Big Minh, Duong Van Minh, his successor, Nguyen Con, Phan Huy Quat, almost every Vietnamese leader in '63 and '64 had deep reservations about too much American influence. And in fact, what we'll see is that when the fateful decision to take over the war in '65 emerges, one of the reasons is going to be that the U.S. finally supports people in South Vietnam, Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Tu, who are willing to accept more American control. So it's the Americans who are pushing to get more deeply involved in Vietnam, and the Southern Vietnamese are resisting. And in fact, you know, the kiss of death for a Southern Vietnamese leader is of what? It's going to be overtures to the other side for a reconciliation or for neutralism or whatever. So it's real, it gets kind of fuzzy at this point. It's not clear cut. It's not, you know, in one hand, it looks like the Americans are coming in to bail out the Vietnamese because they can't do it themselves. And clearly Vietnam is on the ropes. But on the other hand, the Vietnamese in the South are not clamoring for the Americans to come in. They're leery that the Americans will come in and take over, and they're trying to avoid that. And the Americans, the Americans on the military side understand that this is something to worry about. And so if the U.S. does get too involved, this could overstrain the RVN, cause more chaos within the government in Saigon, and lead to even greater disarray. And without any kind of legitimate government, all really is lost. It's kind of complicated. It's not real clear-cut. The civilians think one thing, the military thinks another thing, the Vietnamese think another thing. They don't fit they're not pigeonholed. They don't fit what one's preconceived notions might be. In fact, I mean, if any group is really the aggressor in this, it's the Johnson White House. It's Johnson and McNamara and the Bundys and Rostow. And, you know, some of these tapes that have come out express misgivings and whatnot. That's true. I mean, no one was gleeful about this. I mean, you know, no one was that vampire-like that they were, you know, eager to get into a war and start shooting and killing and whatnot. This isn't, you know, Dr. Strangelove. But in fact, they were very aggressive, and they didn't express great misgivings about it. All right? So that's all kind of background. That's all important, especially when you're focusing on this period of 64 and 65. So it was actually military people then who questioned the usefulness, the efficiency of the air war. Earl Wheeler believed that the government in the South, which is back under the command of Nguyen Khan in the summer of 64. Khan, as I said, was president 3 different times. It's kind of like a Martin and Steinbrenner in the 70s and 80s, right? Nguyen Khan is back in power, and Earl Wheeler believes that Khan's government is too weak to handle the risks of an escalated air war, because if the enemy, the VC or the PAVN, responds to the American air war with intensified offensives in the South, then they believe the ARVN can't handle it. So there are risks. It's, you know, we keep hearing, you know, if Johnson had just bombed more, if he had done this or that. Any aggressive action like that entails a risk. And the risk is always that the enemy will step up its activities to a level that the ARVN can't handle, and the Americans will have to take over. You know, I would almost go so far as to suggest the military was trying to avoid that, and the civilians wanted that. I think they were trying to force the issue to the point where America would have no choice but to come in and bail out southern Vietnam. The military is trying to avoid war. Right? And I have a wonderful quote later on from Maxwell Taylor to that effect. So it's not just me who thinks that. Westmoreland, who, you know, has a reputation as being something of a hawk, he too questioned. It's kind of ironic because in Westmoreland's memoirs, published I think in '76, he kind of has it both ways. On one hand, he talks about having his hands tied, but on the other hand, he's quite candid too about the usefulness of air power. Westmoreland himself said that the real problem isn't northern Vietnam, because these air attacks are against the north, above the 17th parallel. Westmoreland said that's really peripheral. The real problem is the South. And as I've said that before, the real issue is going to be, is the war in the north or is it in the South? And so Westmoreland says it's in the South. And air power in the north isn't going to affect the war in the South or even infiltration into the South. So that's really kind of peripheral. It's almost a sideshow. General Bruce Palmer, who was one of Westmoreland's deputies later, wrote a pretty good book called The 25-Year War, and he said that the over-reliance on air power was one of the tragic mistakes, one of the real crucial mistakes that the United States made, because it always neglected what should have been the prima facie objective of the U.S., which would be to develop an indigenous army, the ARVN, that could pacify and defend its own country. And by focusing on air power, by sending American combat troops in, by progressively taking on responsibilities, the U.S. never forced the southern Vietnamese to develop their own army, their own institutions. And so they remained a dependent throughout this entire war. And without a government in the South, there was no way the U.S. could have succeeded. You can talk strategy and tactics all you want. They could have done this, they could have done that. It's essentially whistling past the graveyard or spitting in the wind, because without a government below the 17th parallel, nothing was going to work.
Hate to interrupt your flow.
That's all right. That's what I'm here for.
But it's just an interesting thought, because when we spoke earlier of the nationalistic fervor of Vietnam over the millennia,
Mm-hmm.
and that the thought that just came to mind was that not only was a strong central government needed in South Vietnam, but that strong central government would have to have created a strong sense of nationhood, that is, something to fight for in the South, and we, as the United States, kept perceiving this thing called North and South Vietnam, when in reality there was no North and South Vietnam culturally or emotionally for the people. And so it's like, you know, there, perhaps even with a strong central government, they still would not have been able to rally the peoples, the masses, around this ideal of a government or of a president or whatever, who in fact are going to stop infiltration, you know, which is really one of the keys, you know, and be able to successfully stop, you know, the NLF.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And when they talk about strong central government, they essentially mean political stability, in the sense probably that, like, Richard Daley was a strong mayor. I mean, when I talk about strong central government, I mean precisely what you said, which was a government which had legitimate nationalist credentials. Now, the irony, of course, is this: we talk about Vietnamese nationalism. We generally say Ho Chi Minh, you know, is the symbol of Vietnamese nationalism, right? In fact, I mean, the ARVN generals and the RVN leaders who the Americans were there with, I think, really did express their own national sentiment. And they didn't like the Americans all that much either. Clearly, they appreciated the fact that the Americans were there. They were writing checks. They were sending troops in. They were giving them equipment and whatnot. There was, you know, plenty of money to be had. But at the same time, there was this real fear, even among those folks, that the Americans would come in and try to take over their country. And there's real misgivings about that at virtually every level of Vietnamese society. And that's why you have 18 governments in 12 months, or whatever the numbers are. Because plenty of those people who the U.S. basically says, oh, they're our boys, all right? This is LBJ. I mean, he probably said that, they're our boys, you know? And, oh, it's like you said of ZM. Shit, man, he's the only boy we got down there, okay? I mean, LBJ still thinks that. And they're not doing what he wants them to do. I mean, Richard Daley would never stand up to LBJ. Sam Yorty wouldn't, would he? No, so this is what LBJ expects, that these people are going to be so grateful that he came to their aid that they're going to do whatever he wants. And in fact, Duong Van Minh and Nguyen Con and Phan Huy Quat are saying, yeah, we appreciate that, but we also want peace. So we're going to talk to the NLF. Maybe we can have a government of reconciliation or a neutral solution or something like that. And it's the Americans who are afraid of that, because nationalism goes many different ways. There's not just one nationalism. Clearly, Ho expresses one kind of nationalism, the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front. But so too did Nguyen Con and Dong Van Minh and Phan Huy Quat. And No Dinh Diem, you know, and No Dinh New, for that matter. So, you know, it's not a misnomer to suggest that all of them in some way or other had nationalist credentials. And the Americans have real trouble with that. I mean, nationalism scares them, even when it's good nationalism. In Latin America, there are wonderful examples where actually right-wingers would use their own versions of nationalism and populism to turn against the U.S. Perón is a good example, who was all over the place. But I mean, nationalism doesn't have to mean socialism or communism, and the U.S. doesn't understand that. So, I mean, when Duong Van Minh says we want a government of reconciliation, or Nguyen Con says that, as far as the U.S. is concerned, he's really not much better than Ho Chi Minh. You know, they'll use him, they'll bring him back into power, but this guy is someone we have to be suspicious about. And so, you know, when especially like when Army leaders look at the air war, they say this is a diversion. I mean, many of them are going to see stuff like that as dangerous diversions, because their overall goal, they believe, has to be developing a society, you know. There's no South Vietnam. The U.S. had to invent it. I mean, there was nothing there. It had to create a country. And the Americans did it more than the Vietnamese did. You know, they actually physically had to create a country, bring in supplies and technology and communications and air conditioning and beer. And then they had to kind of deal with it. I mean, this unleashes all kinds of social forces in the South. Prostitution and drugs and the black market that had been there. I mean, obviously it wasn't nirvana. There were problems there, but it unleashes them on such a massive scale. And the U.S. isn't really prepared for any of that. So it never really understood the implications of what it was doing. And I mean, it may seem like a long leap to go from limited airstrikes above the 17th parallel to social chaos, but that's actually what happens. Because once you basically give the Vietnamese, either explicitly or covertly, the idea, or implicitly, the idea that you're going to make sure that they don't lose, either by air power or combat troops or whatever, then their incentive, clearly, and their own sense of a stake in this is not going to be as strong as it would be otherwise. And that makes perfect sense. So when the Vietnamese, you know, 20 years later say the Americans set us up, they betrayed us, you can see why. I mean, the U.S. essentially went in there to create a country and then let it go. So, I think Bruce Palmer really kind of touches on something that's critical. Questions of strategy and tactics are secondary to the idea that America's goal should have been to develop a government and an army in the South that could have taken care of its own country. Victor Krulak, the Marines Pacific commander, I can't remember it's a terrible acronym. Basically, Krulak later wrote a letter, 1967 or so, to the Navy Secretary Robert Baldwin. And he said, basically, it's time that we admit that South Vietnam is not and never has been a country. And this is damning. I mean, to me, that little statement there is as damning an indictment of the entire war as you'll find. We have to admit that this is not a country we're defending. It's just this mishmash of factions and generals and Buddhists and the government, and everybody's at each other's throats, right? So, yeah, first.
Now, in the South, was it ever the desire for them to have? It wasn't. I mean, there was no desire to have their own country or their. I mean, they didn't want to fight.
Yeah, so I mean, we don't want to say they didn't because there were clearly interests there. But I mean, you're right in a sense. It wasn't their decision to partition. This was something that somebody else decided in 1954 Geneva. It wasn't their decision to have Ngo Dinh Diem come in. I mean, there was an election in '56, but by that time he was in power, and it wasn't the Vietnamese who said we want Ngo Dinh Diem in power. It was basically the Americans who brought him in. So you're right. At each point along the way, it wasn't the Vietnamese saying we want our own country. This is what we want. It was the Americans essentially creating the conditions for it. So it's a real paternal situation, right? And I mean, in fact, it gets to the point even, to kind of buttress this further. At those points when the Vietnamese tried to make peace, as when New makes overtures or when Duong Van Minh and Nguyen Con does, it's the Americans who scuttle that, right? It's not Ho Chi Minh overthrowing the government every other week in South Vietnam. It's the Vietnamese, it's the Southern Vietnamese themselves. So you're right, in a sense, I mean, I don't want to give America too much power in this because it clearly has plenty of willing allies in the South, just like the French had collaborators. But at the same time, America really does have a huge role in creating the structure in which South Vietnam is going to develop in.
Now, but weren't their collaborators mainly the elite versus,
I think, again, if you look at it in terms of people who were in the armed forces, who were leaders of the armed forces, who were business leaders, yeah, I mean, I think there are class differences in that. I mean, that's still controversial, but I think, if you look at the military's own evaluations, I mean, clearly the Viet Cong were still pretty popular at the village level well into the 1960s. So I think you could, fairly say, yeah, I mean, the people who supported the U.S. role in the South were not a broad cross-section of Southern Vietnamese society. I mean, there were plenty of villagers who did. I mean, they had, seen the communists come into their village and kill somebody or do some kind of atrocity. The communists were not angels, as I said before. The Viet Cong clearly were not. But at the same time, I think the Viet Cong probably did have still. If you look at the American military's own evaluations, the Viet Cong had more legitimacy.
Well, and on the social level, it was more, it was a social issue, not a political issue.
What do you mean?
I mean, as far as them, I don't know this is more a question. I mean, they were not so much against communism for the political reasons, but more for social, because they came in and killed somebody.
Yeah.
Or versus the,
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't think at the village level they understood it. They're smart enough to understand. I don't think they interpreted it on those same levels, right? I think that they see it more issues of like rice and taxes and stuff like that. Yeah.
Without getting too far off the track, could you, in a nutshell, explain what made the situation in Vietnam different than the situation in Korea? Because if something might have given U.S. policymakers a reason to believe that this strategy might work, the experience in Korea probably would have been the most direct, previous situation.
Yeah, and I mean, that's Harry Summers' line as well, and Summers is a veteran of Korea, and he kind of was trying to take the Korean situation and impose it on Vietnam. I think, first of all, I don't see Korea as a victory. I mean, Summers basically sees it as a victory. The war ended the same way it started, with division at the 38th parallel. The political conditions, I think, were different. Although Kim Il-sung, the northern leader, did have some support in the South, not nearly the level. I mean, I think Korea was divided far more than Vietnam was. The actual battlefield in Korea was different. I mean, there were guerrilla activities, but the war itself tended to be more conventional, especially in the early stages when, the North attacks and then in June and by September it has all but the Pusan perimeter, right? And then MacArthur counterattacks at Incheon, and pretty soon the UN forces are up there by the Yalu. So it's fairly conventional, fairly traditional, we're kind of racing back and forth. So militarily, I think both politically and militarily, they're much different. Politically, Kim Il-sung is not Ho Chi Minh. I mean, Ho has a different level of credibility, although Kim Il-sung in Korea, I don't want to go give you a history of the Korean War, but I mean, Kim Il-sung is, he was much a Stalinist, very much a Stalinist, but at the same time, he actually did have credibility because he had fought against the Japanese. I mean, while Syngman Rhee was basically collecting checks, it was Kim Il-sung who was fighting in the resistance to the Japanese, just like Ho Chi Minh was. But I think Ho was far more credible as a national leader, a unifying force than Kim Il-sung would be. And militarily, I mean, the theater in Korea was quite different. The stakes were different too. I mean, Korea's 1950. That's the Cold War is still boom. I mean, everyone's, this is a very critical point. And but one thing, of course, to kind of go the other way that's quite similar is that in both cases the military didn't want any part of it, and the U.S. military, didn't really want to get involved in Korea any more than they did in Vietnam. But the other strange thing about that is I never saw in my own work, well, I said this before, the U.S. never said, look at what happened to France. A couple times you'd see that, but by and large, the French experience was irrelevant. The Korean experience wasn't terribly relevant either. I mean, you never really see, well, we did this in Korea, we can do it here. And in fact, the few times that you do are people like Matthew Ridgway, he said air power in Korea was useless, and it's not going to be any more useful here. So it's kind of funny. The military has a tremendous sense of history, which I appreciate as a historian. But at the same time, I get the sense sometimes that they do it, I don't know why, because they don't really listen to it. I mean, they could have said, well, this is what happened to the French. Maybe we can learn something for that. But other than a couple statements to that effect, there's really no analysis done. In the same way, Korea or anything. So, I mean, I appreciate their sense of history. I just think that it could have been used more in this circumstance. Okay. So, so the initial attempt then to change things through the air really meets with a great deal of criticism internally. And in fact, Harold K. Johnson later would say, if anything came out of Vietnam, it was that air power couldn't do the job. Now, if we had Air Force colonels in here right now, standing next to me, and I gave them the mic, they would say, Harold K. Johnson is full of bleep, right? And let me tell you why. So this is clearly there's inter-service rivalry, which is very important at stake here as well, okay? So because of that, LBJ says, I wonder if this is all worth all the effort, but clearly he believes it is. And so the U.S. is going to take a far greater role in Vietnam. At this point, that's the last outline I have. We'll go to these, all right? And I hope you can read them because my handwriting is not all that good. Okay, this will be 31, all right? The first line there, which is kind of the overriding theme, is toward Americanization. And civil military wrangling refers to something we just talked about. I mean, there's still a great deal of debate in 64 and 65 between the civilians and the military over what to do in Vietnam, how we should go about this, all right? From the civilian point of view, the U.S. has to do something, whether it be the introduction of air power after Gulf of Tonkin, the introduction of more advisors, ultimately the introduction of ground troops. The civilians, for their part, remain very suspicious about that. For example, in late 1964, the Army does a study and finds that less than half of the provinces in the South had made any progress at all in pacification. Now, if pacification is supposed to be the most important thing, and less than half the southern provinces have made any noticeable progress at all, you have a problem. In addition to that, they found that only about 20% of the villagers were willing to provide RVN officials with any information about the VC, right? So, pacification is at a standstill, and the southern villagers aren't even willing to talk about the Viet Cong. Now, maybe it's because they're afraid of the Viet Cong reprisal. Maybe it's because they like the Viet Cong. Either way, it's a problem, right? So because of that, the United States really... Oh,
just a technical question.
Yeah.
Can your handwritten outlines be posted on the website,
no.
or is that the problem?
That's the problem right now.
Okay.
I'm assuming it'll be fixed, and I'll put these on with images and all kinds of bells and whistles. But today, just thought, no, it wouldn't post, it wouldn't save. I kept getting this. I could have a big screen here that says document contains no data. You know, which I could put that on my forehead. You know, document contains no data, right? But no, that's the problem. So, you know, as Americans look at this, they see that there's a real problem. Maxwell Taylor, who's, you know, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and then ambassador, basically expects this kind of turmoil to continue. He is not optimistic, and he believes the real problem is that Vietnamese villagers are far more concerned with their own life, their own security, and they're really fed up with what's going on in Saigon. Why should a villager give you information about the NLF and the VC, even if he wants to, when you have a different government in Saigon every week? I mean, is Saigon concerned about security and welfare at the village level? They're concerned about government intrigue. Who's in, who's out, what coup is up, what coup is down. So, and that's another problem. From 63 to 65, basically everything is on hold. The Viet Cong have a free reign throughout the villages because there's no one in the South. You know, think of, I was lecturing today in my survey, in the Articles of Confederation and the chaos during that period, 1780s until 1787, when the Constitution is written, when no one's really in charge, and there's, you know, every state's doing its own thing. Well, you have a similar circumstance here, where it's really social disarray. And if you're a villager, and you see everybody in Saigon going at each other's throats in a different coup every other week, then you don't have a whole lot of, you know, sympathy or a lot of attachment to that government. And the Viet Cong really offer a kind of stability or threat or coercion that you'll respond to, right? So as far as Maxwell Taylor was concerned, the problem wasn't the VC, it wasn't the PAVN. The problem was political instability and corruption and intrigue and things like that. So, and Taylor believes that things are just going to get worse because the two key figures in the post-Diem coup era, Khan and Min, are at it throughout 1964. They're jockeying for position, and Khan and Min really keep coming back and forth, I mean, all the time in 64. And this is only going to magnify the shortcomings that are already evident. So this civil-military wrangling continues, but in the end, who's going to win out? The civilians are, because they have the reins to power. They're constitutionally charged with it. In addition to that, they have a different view of the world, which is far more global than the military's is. Why? Again, credibility. John Mcnaughton is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and he's wonderful because he's very candid, very open and honest about what he believes. And Mcnaughton isn't just howling or whistling in the wind. He actually does represent a mainstream view. I mean, people agree with Mcnaughton. He is an influential member of the administration, and he just says things more clearly than others do, which is why I like to cite him. But Mcnaughton says it is essential for America to maintain its status as a world power. Quote, however badly Southeast Asia may go over the next 2 to 4 years, we have to stay there, even though it's probably going to go bad for the next 2 to 4 years. The United States has to emerge from Vietnam, Mcnaughton says, quote, as a good doctor. This is Mcnaughton. We have to be the good doctor. Quote, we must have kept promises, been tough, taken risks, gotten bloodied, and hurt the enemy very badly in order to prevent other adversaries from questioning our power and resolve. What's the concept there? What's the term? Credibility. We have to be the good doctor. We have to stay in there no matter how bad it is for 2 to 4 years. We must have kept promises, been tough, taken risks, gotten bloodied, and hurt the enemy very badly. Does he say anything in there about democracy or freedom or anything like that? No. All right? So credibility, not victory, really, is Mcnaughton's goal, and I would argue the American goal. All right? So this is a real problem, and the American military folks understand the situation in the South, I think, better than the civilians do. For example, Westmoreland, after this Khan-Min feud continues, says that the ARVN pretty soon is going to lose its will to fight, or it will make a desperate move to regain power. So he's fearing more and more military intrigue. The situation is just getting worse all the time. Okay, so you have this civil-military wrangling. It kind of, again, in a very candid memo, Jacques Valenti, who was LBJ's aide and who is now the head of the Motion Picture Association, writes to LBJ in November of '64, and he says, before you make any final decisions, you better get the military in your corner, because he's afraid of, like, I mentioned the Macarthur hearings before, when Macarthur comes back from Korea after Truman fires him, and there are these hearings, and Macarthur comes out of it as a folk hero, and Truman really looks like the heavy. And Valenti says to Johnson, you know, that could happen again. So you better have the military sign on to anything you do. And that way the military will have been heard, they will have been part of the consensus, and our flanks will be covered in the event of some kind of flap or investigation later. So this, again, the civilians are trying to make sure that if anything goes bad, the military is going to be on board, and it will have a responsibility for that. Okay? So this is the situation. And the civilians and military really are at odds. At the same time, within Vietnam, the VC remain essentially in control of things. They retain the initiative. And throughout 64 and 65, they can pretty much choose the times and places of their attacks, and they're generally successful. For example, on November 1st, actually I can just put the map up because we're, well, this is the okay, it actually showed up. On November 1st at Ben Hoa, which is right outside Saigon, the Viet Cong mortar a U.S. air base, causing a large number of casualties, damaging planes and helicopters and destroying 5 American bombers, B-57s, not 52s. All right? So again, Ben Hoa, November 1st. On Christmas Eve, 1964, the Viet Cong attack a hotel in Saigon, Brinks Hotel, where American officers are billeted, and blow it up. Middle of Saigon, hotel, American officers are there. Viet Cong mortar it on Christmas Eve. So clearly there too then, the Americans aren't able to maintain security of their own installations. Ben Hoa is an air base, by the way. One of the biggest problems is kind of funny. People talk about the air war, and American planes quite often got shot out of the sky. And even bigger problem was American planes getting hit on the tarmac. And one reason the combat troops are going to, because the Americans couldn't protect their own bases. Ben Hoa, Da Nang, Tan Son Nhut, places like that. The Viet Cong, almost with impunity, would strike at American air bases. Why? Well, because they had infiltrated all these. I mean, quite often, these air bases would employ day laborers, Vietnamese, who would come in and work, cleaning up, restocking the candy machines, cleaning the bathrooms, whatever. You need people to work, right? Well, a lot of these people are in LF, and they come back and they have secret information, and they come back and bada bing, next thing you know, Tan Son Nhut or Ben Hoa or Da Nang or Pleiku or whatever is being mortared. All right? So the Americans can't protect their own bases. They can't protect their planes on the ground. At Ben Hoa, 5 B-57s are shot down. They're not shot down out of the sky. They're blown up on the tarmac. And we'll talk about that happening again. Right? So the VC maintained the initiative throughout late 64 and into 1965. And this situation is really getting critical. In the South, political instability continues. And there's a different government every time you turn around, it seems. And they're fearing greater instability because the Nguyen Con and Duong Van Minh are still at each other's throats. All right? Yeah.
This is a minor point. Did you say B-57 or B-47s?
57. It's a bomber, much smaller than a 52, I believe. And they also, I think, hit some helicopters on the tarmac too at that attack in Ben Hoa.
Well, I know they had a B-58.
Yeah. Yeah. It must be true. I wrote it. On Christmas Eve, Brinks Hotel, Saigon. American officers are billeted there. The VC attack it. All right. So clearly then, by early 1965, there's a real crisis, a brewing if it hadn't been already. And as a result, in 1965, George Bundy and Robert McNamara, who are the two most important policymakers in this period. George Bundy is the National Security Advisor, McNamara, of course, the Secretary of Defense. Rusk has a role below theirs, I would argue. Bundy and McNamara go in to meet the president in January of 1965, and they tell him, both of us now, this is from the document they write, both of us now are pretty well convinced that our current policy can lead only to disastrous defeat, which is on the outline here. Our current policy can lead only to disastrous defeat. This is what McNamara and Bundy tell the president. And what is their suggestion? They tell Johnson to, this is a very awkward phrasing that they use, instead of just saying, let's go in, they say, we have to use our military power to force a change of communist policy. Essentially, they're calling for U.S. intervention, U.S. ground troop intervention. Up to this point, what's the U.S. doing? It's sending in so-called advisors. It's training the Vietnamese. It's going on missions. It's American pilots are flying missions. But the Americans are not technically fighting the war. They are not ground combat forces there. And this is what Bundy and McNamara are calling for in a very awkward way. Lyndon Johnson is of the same mind as them. In fact, it's kind of ironic because the military was caught by surprise. Maxwell Taylor later said, quote, "I was caught by surprise by this change in strategy." They weren't expecting this to happen. Taylor said the president was thinking much bigger in this field than I had thought he was. So LBJ, McNamara, and Bundy are way ahead of the military in this idea of combat troops. In fact, George Bundy says, "We have had no recommendations for the military for major ground deployments." All right? In fact, after the Christmas Eve bombing in 1964, the president, the White House, cables Maxwell Taylor in Saigon and says, "If you want, you can use this as an excuse to ask for ground troops." And Taylor and Westmoreland don't want it. They don't want to do that. All right? So there is no real imperative then for intervention as far as the military is concerned. And in fact, the military comes up with some really interesting ideas here. This is in January of 1965. This is fairly late in the game, and it's only a few months before the Americans will come in. And in January of 65, Westmoreland has the MACV staff come up with an overall statement of policy. And it's kind of ironic because Westmoreland, who has a reputation as a hawk, really has a very critical analysis of the situation in 65, where he first, the staff begins talking about the ARVN, and it says it lacks leadership, the desertion rate is high, it has technical weaknesses which run the entire gamut, the ARVN really isn't fighting effectively, and pacification is in disarray. What's worse, the ARVN's senior leaders, the general officers, are absorbed in political activity, right? There is undoubtedly a preoccupation with government intrigue at lower levels, right? So Westmoreland says, you know, we can't send troops in because it's a mess in Vietnam. In fact, earlier he had said, American troops don't belong in Vietnam. This is a Vietnamese war. In January of 65, he goes on in even greater detail and basically looks at the various options, sets up, you know, we could do this, 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 and this. His conclusion is that the advisory system that's currently in place is terribly flawed, and it's America's best bet, despite that, despite the fact that it was flawed. He said, we've already spent a great deal of time trying to develop the ARVN. Quote, this is Westmoreland and his staff talking. If that effort to develop the ARVN, if that effort has not succeeded, there's even less reason to think that U.S. combat forces would have the desired effect. I realize I'm spending a lot of time on this, but I think this is really telling. 10 weeks before American ground troops come ashore, the commander of American forces and the ambassador are both coming to the same conclusion. American ground forces will not help. They shouldn't be introduced. So this is Westmoreland, who's hardly a dove. Westmoreland is not a peacenik. He's not a hippie, right? Westmoreland and his staff say, the Vietnamese, if we intervene, the Vietnamese will either let us take over the war, and they'll sit back and do less and less as we do more and more, or they will actively turn against us. He was right on both counts. It's right on both counts. So what is their conclusion? The involvement of American ground troops in Vietnam, quote, would at best, buy time, but would lead to ever-increasing commitments until, like the French, we would be occupying an essentially hostile foreign country. All right? That's fairly, I mean, that's really incredible when you think about it. This is William Westmoreland in January of 1965 saying, if we send ground combat forces in, it will lead to a situation in which we are, quote, occupying an essentially hostile foreign country. All right? You know, actually, I could have put these on a computer and printed them out, but, you know, it's more fun trying to figure out what I'm saying, isn't it? So they would be occupying an essentially hostile foreign country. That's fairly damning, all right? I mean, this is just weeks. Do you have a question? Oh, I thought somebody had a question over there. This is just weeks before that. Maxwell Taylor agrees with Westmoreland. And in fact, Taylor, yeah.
I just wanted to ask you that the last quote you read from Westmoreland and his staff, what kind of distribution did this document receive?
The White House
was it handed out pretty widely? Or?
The White House saw it, yeah, absolutely. It was a memo from McNamara, I believe. I could check my footnotes on that. But it was, oh yeah, it was widely distributed to everybody who was in the loop, absolutely. I mean, the White House was aware of it. The White House was under no preconception that the military was on the same page as them. Everybody knew that they were dragging their feet. They were quite upset about it, actually. They had some real issues with the military for going slowly. Yeah.
But picking up on James' question, the circulation at that time was within the loop of people. When was it first discovered after the fact? Was it in the Pentagon Papers or on your research?
That
This
particular
Westmoreland
document?
yeah.
I never saw it before I found it at the LBJ library. That doesn't mean that I'm probably lucky. It probably had just been declassified when I got up there or something like that. I'd never seen it cited before. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where you read it and it just changes everything. It's like, whoa. Because up to that point, I thought Westmoreland was Strangelove, you know?
It wasn't in Westmoreland's book.
No, it wasn't. And that's kind of ironic. Well, I could go off on a riff about that, which I often do, but I'll try to make it short. One thing that surprises me is that after the war ended, the basic military line was they didn't let us fight. They had our hands tied behind our back. And it's kind of funny because they, I think even more credibly, absolutely more credibly could have said, look, we never wanted to do this in the first place. They made us. But you never hear that. And I think it's because if they said, look, we never wanted to do this, it was a mistake, that kind of puts them in the same camp as George McGovern and Frank Church and SDS and all these other hippies, right? And they can't do that. And I think for public consumption and for institutional reasons, they get off much better by saying, look, they never let us fight. They kept us with our hands tied behind our back. But you can make a far better case that, you know, we weren't in there. We never wanted to do this. It was Johnson who made us do it, or Kennedy, or whatever. So, somebody else? You push down. Oh.
How serious do you think, in terms of that argument, they never let us fight?
Yeah.
How realistic was it? People were concerned that an invasion of North Vietnam would lead to escalation of the war, bring China, and possibly eventually lead to a nuclear showdown. I mean, was that realistically a fear on the part of the political leadership?
Yeah, it was. Johnson talked about that quite a bit. I mean, I'm kind of glad he did. I think it's legitimate. I mean, I don't think you can dismiss that by saying, oh, that would have never happened. And that's a serious concern. A lot of people are talking about that, yeah. I don't know if it would have or not, but China had 100,000 advisors in northern Vietnam, and logistical and engineering and stuff like that. Not people fighting, but there were 100,000 Chinese troops in northern Vietnam. So it would have been like Korea in that sense. You would have had direct involvement between American and Chinese forces. This is during the Cultural Revolution. China's not terribly stable to begin with. Is it worth the risk? Is Vietnam worth the risk of a war against the Chinese or an all-out Asian war or nuclear exchange? Yeah, so I mean, that wasn't a myth. I mean, there really were. And LBJ especially was deeply concerned about that. He raised that issue quite a bit.
Well, then this is the second question.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you to editorialize here in a way that maybe you wouldn't otherwise do. When you're getting, well, you probably would, but when you're getting advice from your military, like what they were getting in these memos that the public never saw, but that were circulated, and at the same time you have this situation where you don't want to risk more than it's worth. Mm-hmm. What made people believe that they could make this work? Was it just pure arrogance, believing their own hype of American, power?
A lot, yeah. I think a lot of it was the sense that these people don't really know what defeat is, right? I mean, that's the World War II generation. They defeated the Nazis and they created this major power. So, I mean, as LBJ would often say, Ho Chi Minh, this little guy, how can they defeat us? So, to some level it is. On the other hand, one might argue, and I'm not sure, I'm not trying to fudge this, I have no problem with editorializing. I'm not sure because I think part of it, yes, is absolute arrogance. Part of it is the kind of Frank Sneb's decent interval argument. Yeah, we know things are bad, but we don't want it to happen while we're in charge. So let's just prolong this and then dump it into somebody else's lap. So I think there's some of that too. There's the whole credibility argument. And Mcnaughton says that. We have to be here for 2 to 4 years, gotten bloody, taken hits, to show that we're going to stand tough, to show that we have resolve and we have will. Did they think they were going to make a difference? Yeah, I think there was some arrogance there that suggested, yes, we'll eventually win out. you know, the Vietnamese will have a breaking point. That was kind of part of the argument. At some point, these people can't take it. I mean, one thing I haven't stressed, and I'll talk about more, is the Vietnamese are getting banged up real badly. And they're getting bombed and attacked and mortared and artillery. I mean, the Viet Cong are getting, you know, and the northern Vietnamese are getting hit very hard. When the war's over, they lose 2 to 2.5 times more people than the South does. So the Americans keep thinking they have to have a breaking point. No, I mean, Ngo Vinh Long, who has an article in our Reader, was a teaching assistant. He was a TA for Henry Kissinger at Harvard. And Kissinger, that was Kissinger's basic argument. This is before Kissinger became, you know, National Security Advisor or Secretary of State. He was still at Harvard, but he was, you know, kind of running errands for Rockefeller and for Johnson and for Nixon and everybody else. He was kind of a madman for hire, I guess. Kissinger would tell Ngo Vinh Long, look, they have a breaking point. They cannot withstand what we're doing to them. And Ngo Vinh Long is sitting there trying to tell them, we've been withstanding this for 2,000 years. This is not going to break us. And Kissinger wouldn't listen. So a lot of it is that arrogance. Yeah, these people are going to have a breaking point, right? So I think a good deal of it is that. But another part of it is just that, you know, we don't want to be blamed for it. This is not going well. It probably won't. Let's hope somebody else gets the blame for it. And we have to stay in it anyway because our credibility is at stake. So I think it's a combination of those things. Was there legitimate blue sky optimism? I didn't see it. I don't see it. I don't think even Walt Rostow, you know. There's a funny story, John Paul Vann. This is later in like 67, but John Paul Vann and Rostow are talking, and Rostow says something like, you know, do you think the war can last another 6 months? Meaning, you know, we have them on the run, we're going to win. And Vann says, oh, hell no, Mr. Rostow, we can hold out a lot longer than that. So, but even Rostow, I think, you know, deep down understood this is not going that well. Yeah. So, I mean, the public statements, you know, light at the end of the tunnel, which we'll talk about later, and we've turned the corner and all that. I mean, you know, they used to call the military briefings the 5 o'clock follies because they'd come up there at 5 o'clock every day and some MACV press officer would stand up talking about, we did this operation, or we killed so many enemies, and we did this and that. And everybody knew it was a joke. And then, you know, off the record, all these people would say, we're up to it up to here, you know, we can't do anything. So I think it's all those things. I think it's arrogance. I think it's you know, deferring, you know, a decent interval before we lose, and part of it also is credibility. Yeah. So, and Taylor, I mean, you know, in 1965, early 65, just 10 weeks before ground combat troops come in, you have Westmoreland saying, you know, we will be occupying an essentially hostile foreign country. Maxwell Taylor, looking at the government intrigue because there's another coup coming up in January of 65, says it's time for the Americans to do some, quote, hard soul searching, decide whether we can tolerate another coup, get rid of Khan, or accept the consequences. And what does Taylor say? Some of the consequences are, quote, which might entail ultimate withdrawal. I've seen very few cases where any government official actually used that term, withdrawal. Taylor was one of them. On a couple occasions, he said, maybe we should just get out of here. This is the guy, he was ambassador at the time, but he's Army Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was really frustrated and fed up. And again, does Taylor go with this? Not really. I mean, Taylor basically, you know, he's kind of a Greek tragic figure. He expresses all these, what's the Cassini? I don't know what the character in Greek mythology is, but, you know, he expresses all these deep misgivings and doubt and everything, but then he just goes on. He's not like Ridgway at Dien Bien Phu, who just basically, you know, put his fist down and said, we're not going to do this. Taylor never does that. Would it have made a difference? Who knows? Probably not, but never tried. So Taylor thinks that the U.S. has incredibly stark choices, and the biggest mistake it could make would be to fight a ground war in Vietnam. In fact, there's another coup. Nguyen Khan comes back in late January 65, and Taylor says we shouldn't even recognize Nguyen Khan's government. In fact, the U.S. has to be prepared to reduce the advisory effort to simple policy guidance. We should just be giving them suggestions anymore, or disengage and let the South Vietnamese stand alone. This is Taylor saying, let's maybe just get out or withdraw or whatever. All right, what does Taylor say? The U.S. is on a losing track and must change course or suffer defeat, early or late, as one chooses to interpret the known facts. Right? This is Maxwell Taylor, just like William Westmoreland in January of 65. Terribly bleak, terribly pessimistic. But what does George Bundy say after he reads these? Bundy had talked to Taylor and Westmoreland. He was aware of it. He says, yeah, the consequences of both escalation and withdrawal are really bad, but we simply must find a way of making our present policy work. That kind of responds to the question you just asked me. And I think that speaks to credibility. You know, we're up the creek. We're in between Scylla and Charybdis, right? Escalation means we have this wider war, which is going to be a disaster. Withdrawal means we look like whatevers, we're pansies. It's kind of this macho aspect to it as well. So we have to make this work. And at LBJ at one point during a conversation with Fulbright says something almost the exact same thing. He says, all I know how to do is to do more of the same. So it's like, if you have a headache and you take a couple aspirin and they don't work, you take 2 more and 2 more and 2 more. It's the American way of doing things, right? If this doesn't work, you do more of it, right? Instead of changing directions. And this is essentially what's happening. So with these attitudes and with this military reluctance and civilian aggression, it's almost inevitable then that something's going to pop, and it does. In '65, you start to see a real fast succession. All right? The first one occurs in February of '65 at a place called Pleiku. Pleikus are like streetcars. I have that up there for a reason, which I'll mention in a minute. Pleiku is right here. Maybe you can see this in the Central Highlands. 100 miles from Cambodia? That close, okay. Oh, that's right. I forget. Vietnam is terribly thin across the Central Highlands. I don't know what the scale on this map is. So it's very close to the Cambodian border. It's in the Central Highlands, not populated much at all, very light population, strategically an area that's not terribly important, although I think the real concern there was Pavan, right? Yeah, it will be because of Yajong. There's an American barracks, an army barracks at Pleiku. Right? In February of 1965, I had photos of this actually until things went awry. In February of 1965, George Bundy visits Pleiku, and he's met at the airport by Westmoreland and Taylor, and he's going to go to Pleiku and talk to Westmoreland and Taylor to find out what's going on. He wants to get to the bottom of this thing. Okay, so this is the National Security Advisor. This is a pretty big mucky muck, right? And he's at Pleiku. Now, one would think that the National Security Advisor would be protected. Well, the Viet Cong decide that since McGeorge Bundy's there, they're going to send a message. You're not safe anywhere. So while Bundy is at Pleiku, the VC mortar an army barracks there. They kill 9 and wound 109 Americans, and they destroy 22 aircraft. All right? And again, they'd had infiltrators. So while Bundy, they can't even protect the base while the National Security Advisor is there. So this is really a great source of agony for the Americans. I mean, my God, this really looks bad, doesn't it? You can't even defend a base where your own National Security Advisor is staying in the VC attack, and it's just really horrific. In fact, since I don't have the web page, I have some artist renditions. I had like a court reporter. So here's an artist rendition of the attack at Pleiku. All right. This is the same person who did the O.J. Simpson trial court. Does the person who did them want to be acknowledged for it, or just keep your head low? It was actually James, who not only will grade your test, but also does all the artist rendition. So this is an artist rendition of the attack at Pleiku. You can see they're blowing up an airplane here, and there's the guard who is utter. Yes, exactly. This is an exact rendition, a historical facsimile, as they used to say in Birth of a Nation, right? That's an airplane getting blown up, right? So since we don't have images, I didn't want to go totally cold turkey today. So I did go to great measures to pay somebody to do this, right? All right. What's that? That pay part, we'll talk about that, yeah. All right. So after the attack on Pleiku, what do the Americans do? Well, this becomes the basis for Operation Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder is an American air campaign. Rolling Thunder will actually become the most intense air offensive in history. In the course of 3 years, from 65 to 68, the United States, during Operation Rolling Thunder, isn't that a wonderful name, Rolling Thunder? You get the imagery, right? It's now, a motorcycle rally to D.C., right? Once a year? Every year? Okay. Rolling Thunder is a code name for the American Air War. Above the 17th parallel from 65 to 68. Initially, the raids begin in an effort to persuade Ho Chi Minh to quit supporting the war in the South. And this is why the Army criticized it, because their argument was, the war isn't in the North. You're not going to persuade him to do anything because the problem is in the South. All right? And at various times, it would continue. Initially, it was, I wish they had parallels on here. Let's see. All right, let's say the 17th parallel is right around here. All right, Hue, right above Hue, Quang Tri. These are all in South Vietnam. This is North Vietnam, okay? Initially, the attacks were confined below the 20th, let's say around Vinh and Ha Tin. I could be off on that. in short time, they're expanded by, within, I don't know, 6 months to a year. Rolling Thunder, there are actually like 7 or 8 different phases to the Rolling Thunder campaign. Within a few months, actually May, American pilots are given leeway, and eventually they can hit anything except for there's about a 30-mile circumference outside Hanoi that they have to avoid, and also Haiphong, which is a port where especially Russian ships are coming in to provide supplies. The Americans don't want, this kind of gets to something you asked earlier, the Americans don't want to provoke a wider war by like blowing up a Russian ship or something like that. So except for like this 30-mile area around Hanoi and Haiphong, eventually Rolling Thunder basically encompasses most of North Vietnam. So again, this idea, when when you hear we had our hands tied behind our back, you get the sense that there were specific, very, very tight. And in fact, quite often LBJ would sign off on bombing runs. But at the same time, there really was a fair amount of latitude there, basically in terms of hitting a POL, petroleum oil lubricants. Vietnam's not a highly industrialized society anyway, blowing up bridges and whatnot. So Rolling Thunder was pretty comprehensive, yeah.
Did they do this because they ran out of targets below the 20th parallel?
Well, no, and that's the interesting thing. I mean, it's one of the, there are many ironies, of course, in the Vietnam era, but the United States dropped twice as many bombs on its ally than it did on the enemy. It bombed South Vietnam twice the level it bombed North Vietnam. So no. And in fact, just as we had an artist rendering, we also have an artist rendering of Operation Rolling Thunder. Okay? And you can see there's the bombs flying above the 17th parallel attacking Vietnam. Okay? This is another exact facsimile there. Now, just this kind of, because somebody always asks me this is not B-52 attacks. B-52s are flying missions, but technically they're under something called Operation Arc Light. A-R-C-L-I-G-H-T, Arc Light. So Rolling Thunder technically is not the bombing test, but they're all part of the same campaign. Okay? So this is Operation Rolling Thunder, right? So you got a good look of that, right? Which is exactly like the photo I was going to show you. Okay? So Rolling Thunder is the response then to Pleiku. Now, why do I say Pleikus are like streetcars? Because what was the American justification for Rolling Thunder? Another little piece of trivia, because somebody may call me on this. There was actually an air campaign before Rolling Thunder called Flaming Dart, and that lasted about 4 days. I mean, it was fairly short-lived, maybe more than that. I'm probably being exaggerating here. But Flaming Dart begins on February 8th and 9th, and Rolling Thunder begins on February 13th. Okay? So Rolling Thunder is far bigger and far more important, but so I just wanted to kind of get that out. What's the explanation for Rolling Thunder? Rolling Thunder, the Americans say, is a response to Pleiku. Because they had the temerity to mortar our base, we're going to bomb them. All right? However, McGeorge Bundy, who's in town, utters what is one of my favorite quotes of the Vietnam era. Pleikus are like streetcars. Okay? Basically, what's that mean? The U.S. had plans for Rolling Thunder well before the attack at Pleiku. You have contingency plans, right? They're essentially, what Bundy's saying is, we're looking for an excuse. Pleiku becomes that excuse. But if Pleiku hadn't happened, Pleikus are like streetcars. If you miss the bus, what do? You wait for the next one, which is going to come along in 20 or 30 minutes, right? So if Pleiku doesn't happen, something else is going to, because we know how the enemy works. We know that they're pretty good at this, and we know the ally is having some problems. So if Pleiku doesn't happen, something else will. We'll get our war. Yeah.
I'm curious that the initial bombing below the 20th parallel appears to be in the very narrow mountainous area of the old Annam. What is there any reasoning or any sense to that?
Some of it was based on the idea. Well, again, you can't. There's no easy answers to these. I wish I could just say yes or no. Yes. There was always a debate over the goals of the air war, actually, within the military. Was it to send a message to Ho Chi Minh that he would pay too great a price? Was it to terrorize the Vietnamese people into submission? Was it to stop infiltration into the South, in which case you would probably have to bomb much further to the west along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which they do, right? And we'll talk, I mean, at the same time this is going on, the U.S. is bombing Laos, and I will get to that separately just because it's easier that way. But what's the goal here? It's to send a message. I think it's the primary goal. Some of it's to stem infiltration, but principally you hear them talking about sending a message to Ho Chi Minh. All right. And remember, what does LBJ say? I'm going to go up Ho's pecker 1 inch at a time. Now I got Ho's pecker in my pocket. So this is kind of sending a signal to Ho Chi Minh. If you don't play ball, you're going to get more of this, all right? But there would always be a huge debate in American circles over what the damn goal of the air war was. So, I mean, it was really, difficult, complicated from the beginning. Yeah.
So the Annam is literally going up the pecker 1 inch.
Yeah, because you start here in Annam, right, and then pretty soon, there you go, except for that 30-mile radius.
And so LBJ was probably doing that as a
It was called graduated escalation. I mean, I'm giving you an incredibly detailed history of Vietnam. I know that, and I see some value in that. But the actual phrase they used was graduated escalation. Now, this was a debate. I mean, Maxwell Taylor and others kind of like this. People like Curtis LeMay basically wanted to hit everything. As LeMay, well, this was earlier, once said, we got to quit swatting flies off the shit pile. That's what he considered. He said, we got to go for everything, all right? So there's a real debate in American circles. Do we gradually escalate this until it gets to the point where Ho Chi Minh is afraid what we might do and finally backs off, or do we just go all at once? LBJ thought that too much at one time would be provocative, might create a wider war. I'm terribly critical of LBJ, but on this count, I think that was a legitimate concern. All right? And there were other military people. Maxwell Taylor believed the same thing. He believed in graduated escalation, a little bit at a time. And Bundy did too, Rusk. If the Vietnamese, if Ho Chi Minh doesn't respond, then we up the ante. We keep turning the screws on him tighter and tighter, and we get closer and closer and closer to stuff that really is going to make a difference to him. We'll stay away from Hanoi and Haiphong because those are red flags. We hit Hanoi, we hit Haiphong, then we're guaranteeing big problems. So we're going to stay away from that. But otherwise, and this is why, you mentioned that in an email, when Nixon comes into power, he doesn't have the same problems. He doesn't have the same fears because he's doing détente and ping-pong diplomacy and all that. So he basically takes care of that first, and then he's free in '72, especially during the Christmas bombings, to essentially hit anything he wants because he knows China and Vietnam aren't going to come in at that point because they don't really care about Vietnam. They're more concerned about their own détente situation. But LBJ doesn't have that same kind of political leverage or political flexibility. So this is, going up 1 inch at a time. The area, I mean, Annam, like you said, it's very strategically, this area is not terribly important, but you keep moving up from the 20th parallel to the point where, except for these areas. In addition, you don't want to go too far. I mean, a couple times the U.S. actually violated Chinese airspace, and nothing came of it, but I've seen the memos, and there was a great deal of concern about that, or alarm. And in fact, they moved to the next level of preparedness and whatnot. And they were deeply afraid of, accidentally dropping a bomb along, that would land on the wrong side of the border or something like that. This is, remember, when MacArthur went too far, China sends troops in via the Yalu. I mean, MacArthur was actually bombing forces across the Yalu River. So they don't want to do that again. And Johnson very frequently talks about Korea and Chinese and whatnot. During the Korean War, the Chinese who intervened were called volunteers. So Johnson would often say, what do we do if volunteers come in? Meaning, what do we do if the Chinese come in? We can't provoke them.
You have to be careful because you could bomb their embassy or something.
We'll see. I mean, maybe they were using the same maps back last spring. That was the problem, right? They could have just downloaded them off Netscape, right? So Rolling Thunder becomes the answer to Pleiku, but it's really, it's in the works and it's going to happen anyway. What's the impact of Rolling Thunder? Rolling Thunder doesn't have a great impact, and this is something that's open to huge debate, and you would find somebody who disagrees fully with that. All right. Rolling Thunder initially doesn't do much simply, and this is a problem the air war had the whole time, because the weather's bad. I mean, Vietnam has a monsoon season, and air operations are terribly difficult when you're flying in monsoons, right? In addition to that, the North Vietnamese have a very, very capable anti-aircraft capability. They're very good at that. They have surface-to-air missiles, which they get from the Soviet Union. So the cost to Americans, I don't have absolute figures, I've been looking for them on that, is really quite huge. The Vietnamese shoot down a lot of American planes. I mean, they create 500 POWs from the air war. So, I mean, there's a price to pay. It's not like the Americans are just going in. It's not like the Gulf War in '91, which was kind of shooting fish out of a barrel in many ways, because the Iraqis had more or less, mothballed their air force. The Vietnamese are fighting back, and they have a tremendously successful anti-aircraft capacity. And so there are prices to pay for it. So the weather's bad. You have Vietnamese. So we'll talk more about this as we go on. But Rolling Thunder, the actual effectiveness of it is always open for question. In fact, in the earliest phases of it, the Vietnamese actually did quite well. The Americans had difficulty, for one thing, flying sorties. A sortie is a mission where you fly, you dump your payload, and come back. The Americans had trouble flying sorties because of the weather. And then of the first 44 airstrikes, which include more than one plane going out, I'm not sure what the exact number of planes is, but of the first 44 strikes, the northern Vietnamese shot down 25 planes. So, there's a great deal of success there. It's not like, we go out, we drop, we kill them, we come back. There's a risk involved. War has become so antiseptic, I think, in the last 10 years, both in the Gulf and in Kosovo, where the Americans lost virtually nobody, that, you kind of lose a sense of the fact that these people are fighting. Vietnam is far more like the Battle of Britain or the Blitz than it is, anything we've seen since then. So there is a real risk, and so the actual usefulness of Rolling Thunder from a military standpoint really is open to question, despite what a lot of people would have you say. But in addition to that, politically, a lot of people don't see it making a difference. Westmoreland was never a huge advocate of the air war because he didn't know whether it would really, help things all that much. And in fact, he didn't see anything really changing in February and March of '65. In fact, the situation is getting worse. So the air war is not a panacea. And to be fair, no one really thought it would be. But it's getting worse. And so by February, late February of '65, Westmoreland and others, not even 2 months after saying, if we send in troops, we'll be occupying an essentially hostile foreign country. Not even 2 months after that, Westmoreland and others start to say, look, we're probably going to have to send in combat troops. And so in late February, Westmoreland requests a Marine BLT, Battalion Landing Team, with Mayo. Laughter? Okay. Requests the Marine BLT, a Battalion Landing Team, to Da Nang. Da Nang is, which we've shown before, right here. This is an American base on the coast. All right. What's the problem at Da Nang? Same problem at Bien Hoa, Pleiku, Tan Son Nhut. Americans can't protect their own base at Da Nang. So Westmoreland requests the Marine Battalion Landing Team at Da Nang to essentially protect the American base. He also asks for more helicopters and things like that. Right. This is a distinct reversal in what Westmoreland had said, not even 2 months earlier. All right? Basically, the situation has gotten much worse, and he is not real optimistic that the Rolling Thunder is going to make a big difference. So he requests the Marine Battalion Landing Team to come in to Da Nang. All right? Why? Westmoreland says the Viet Cong's strength, armament, professionalism, and activity have increased to the point where we can ill afford any longer to withhold available military means from Vietnam. The situation has gotten so bad, unless we come in now, it's lost. It's that grave. And this is just a month after Bundy and McNamara say to Johnson, our policy can only lead to disastrous defeat. Why does Westmoreland want troops there? Does he want them to fight? No. He does not believe Americans should fight. He does not believe too many American troops should come in. He says that there are really only two areas where we can make a difference, air and surface sea power. So he's not really thinking that the combat troops are the difference. He believes that, continue fighting from the air. But he just said that wasn't going to work, didn't he? But at least you don't lose as many people that way. So this is the basic goal at the time, right? Westmoreland, though, adds a caveat, as Al Haig would say. He has a big qualifier at the end. He says, no matter what steps we take, quote, it is most important, this is real important, this is a good quote, it's worth listening to. Westmoreland, it is most important to avoid the impression by friends and enemies alike that the U.S. has taken over responsibility for the war from the Vietnamese. This is when Westmoreland asked for combat troops. It's worth repeating. It's most important to avoid the impression by friends and enemies alike that the U.S. has taken over responsibility for the war from the Vietnamese. As he said just a few months earlier, this is still the Vietnamese's war. This is William Westmoreland, you know, the hawk, right? The war supporter. So even this late in the game, the Americans are still very wary of that, right? The Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Forces, Admiral USG, Ulysses S. Grant, Sharp, was also concerned about American movements toward the ground troop in the ground troop area. Sharp, in fact, remember when we talked about pinning down the president, Sharp's still trying to do that. He says that we need a positive statement of national policy and specifically a command decision as to whether we will actively participate. They're going to send these troops over, but what do we do once we get there? We need LBJ to make a decision. So Westmoreland is saying, we don't want them to think we're taking over, and Sharp is saying, we need a decision, all right? Wheeler, after meeting with LBJ, says, we need to press forward, despite difficulties, to achieve the limited objectives set by the U.S. in Vietnam. However, Wheeler says, there's evident concern that we're not doing enough to achieve these objectives. So there's really ambivalence, real concern there. What are our objectives? Well, they're limited. What are they? Well, we're not really sure, but they're limited. We need to protect our bases, all right? So it's really kind of mixed signals in February and early March of 1965. Despite that, though, the Americans will go in. They will send ground combat troops into Da Nang. And we will talk more about that after this short break. Go to your fridges, crack open a beer, get one from me. Okay.